The winter of 1907 was harsh in the foothills of the Zabrzeża highlands, the snow piling high against the timber frames of the cottages in Smebyhov. It was here, on January 28th, that Jiří Bezděk was born into a world teetering on the edge of monumental change. He grew up in the shadow of the Great War, a child of the Austro-Hungarian twilight who came of age in the fresh, optimistic air of the First Czechoslovak Republic. By the time he left school, the map of Europe had been redrawn, and young men like Jiří were looking for their place within it. He was a young man of restless intellect and physical vigor. After a brief stint in casual labor, drifting between temporary jobs that failed to satisfy his ambition, the 18-year-old Bezděk made a decisive choice. In 1925, he volunteered for a 2-year commitment to the military, assigned to the 27th Infantry Regiment, stationed in the historic garrison city of Olomouc. The regiment was a place of discipline and drill, but for Bezděk, Olomouc offered something more potent: knowledge. While his days were consumed by the parade ground and the barracks, his evenings were spent in the quiet pursuit of education. He began privately attending lectures at a local teaching institute, balancing the rifle with the textbook, fueled by a desire to elevate himself beyond the station of a laborer. He left the army in 1926 with the rank of sergeant, a disciplined demeanor, and a mind fired by the political radicalism sweeping the continent. The devastation of the war and the inequalities of the old world had pushed many of his generation toward the left. That same year, Bezděk committed himself to the cause, joining the Communist Party of Czechoslovakia. He believed, with the fervor of youth, that a new dawn was breaking in the East, and he wanted to be part of its light. It was not long before destiny offered him a path to that perceived utopia. An acquaintance, Rudolf Shady, a member of the Kosnicka Jednota, an association with Protestant roots that maintained ties with Czech expatriates, approached him with a proposition. There were Czech villages in the Soviet Union, remnants of 19th-century migration, that were in desperate need of teachers. To Bezděk, this was not merely a job offer, it was a pilgrimage. He accepted without hesitation. In 1927, Bezděk packed his meager belongings and traveled east, crossing the border into the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. He arrived in the municipality of Vyšehrad, a Czech settlement in Ukraine. At first, the reality seemed to match the dream. He threw himself into his work, teaching the children of farmers who still spoke the language of his homeland. The soil was rich, the community tight-knit, and the promise of socialism seemed tangible in the collective spirit of the era. A year after his arrival, his integration seemed complete. He married Helena Yandova, a local woman, and to solidify his loyalty to his new home, he transferred his political allegiance, joining the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. It was not long before the golden haze of the late 1920s was rapidly dissipating. As the decade turned, the atmosphere in Ukraine grew heavy with dread. Stalin's grip was tightening. The forced collectivization of agriculture began to tear the countryside apart, and with it came a paranoia that seeped into every village council and schoolhouse. The Czech minority, once seen as industrious fellow travelers, was suddenly viewed with suspicion. The authorities began to whisper of foreign spies and counter-revolutionary plots. The Kosnicka Jednota, the very organization that had facilitated Bezděk's arrival, was branded a religious fascist organization. The first arrests began quietly, a teacher here, a community leader there, but soon the silence of the nights was broken regularly by the sound of engines and a hammering on doors. Contact between the expatriates and Czechoslovakia was severed, leaving them isolated in a gathering storm. For Bezděk, the personal and the political collided with tragic force in the summer of 1930. On July 7th, his wife gave birth to their first child, a moment that should have been the happiest of his life, but the joy was suffocated by the terror enveloping the region. 11 days later, on July 18, 1930, Bezděk traveled to Kiev, perhaps hoping to clarify his status or seek news. He never returned home. He was arrested on the streets of the city, swept up in a dragnet that claimed 41 others, teachers, farmers, and prominent figures of the Czech community. He was thrown into an OGPU prison in Kiev, a place where the air stank of unwashed bodies and fear. For weeks, he was held in limbo, unaware of the fate of his wife and newborn. On August 25th, the entire group of defendants was transferred to Kharkov, the then capital of the Ukrainian SSR. There, the machinery of the show trial began to grind them down. The interrogations were daily, relentless, and brutal. The interrogators cared little for truth. They needed confessions to fit a pre-written narrative. By March 1931, the indictment was finalized. The charges were a fantastical tapestry of fabrication, espionage, counter-revolutionary activities in the service of Czechoslovakia and France, agitation against the Soviet government, resistance to collectivization, and religious propaganda. Bezděk, the committed communist who had traveled across Europe to serve the revolution, was now branded its enemy. The trial was held from June 12 to 14, 1931, in the OGPU club building in Kharkov, a setting designed for theater, not justice. It was an extraordinary session of the Supreme Court of the USSR, meant to send a message to all minority groups in the borderlands. When the sentences were read, the room fell into a terrified silence. 10 of the defendants, Jiří Bezděk included, were sentenced to death by shooting. Others received 10 or 3 years in prison, followed by exile. From the courtroom, the condemned men were hauled back to the solitary confinement cells of Kharkov prison. Bezděk sat in the darkness, waiting for the executioner's footsteps, contemplating the end of his life at age 24. But the Soviet bureaucracy was unpredictable. Soon they were moved again, this time to a prison for political prisoners in Yaroslavl, deep in Russia. It was there, in the crushing isolation of his cell, that Bezděk received news that shattered whatever spirit he had left. His wife, under immense pressure, and likely to save herself, had divorced him. Worse, his child, the infant he had held for only a few days, had perished, a victim of the catastrophic famine that was ravaging Ukraine, the Holodomor. He had lost his freedom, his name, his wife, and his child. Bezděk languished in Yaroslavl for 2.5 years. Then, on August 25, 1933, the gears of the Gulag turned again. He and the other surviving Czech prisoners were transported north to the notorious Solovetsky correctional labor camp. This was the heart of the darkness, a former monastery on an archipelago in the White Sea, turned into a laboratory of human suffering. They were assigned to the 8th section, tasked with forestry work near the Savatiev Hermitage for the construction of the White Sea-Baltic Canal. The conditions were infernal. The cold was a physical weight, the rations starvation level, the work relentless. The journey to the Solovetsky Islands had finally broken Bezděk's mind. Under the strain of grief and the terror of his environment, he went temporarily insane. For nearly a year, until July 1934, he lived in a haze of psychosis, his mind retreating from a reality too painful to endure.
Yet survival in the Gulag was often a matter of blind luck. Unlike many of his compatriots who perished in the frozen earth of Solovki, Bezděk survived his madness in the winter. On July 18, 1935, exactly 5 years to the day since his arrest in Kyiv, a guard handed him a piece of paper. His death sentence, which had technically been hanging over him or converted to indefinite imprisonment, was formally commuted to 5 years in prison and 5 years in exile. Since he had already served the 5 years of imprisonment, he was to be shipped out immediately. 3 days later, he was put on a transport, beginning an odyssey that would take him across the vast, terrifying expanse of the Eurasian continent. First, he was taken by train north to Murmansk, held briefly in a central OGPU transit camp where the sun barely set. From there, the long, rattling journey south and east began. He was moved like livestock in prison wagons, passing through Petrozavodsk, Leningrad, and Vologda. He crossed the Urals, the spine of Russia, moving through Vyatka, Perm, and Sverdlovsk. In Tyumen, a momentary lapse in surveillance allowed for a small miracle. Bezděk managed to secretly smuggle a letter out to the Polish Red Cross in Moscow. It was a message in a bottle cast into a turbulent sea, but it found its mark. The Red Cross informed the Czechoslovak authorities and, crucially, his aging parents in Moravia that Jiří was alive. From Tyumen, the journey pressed deeper into Siberia, through Omsk to Krasnoyarsk. In early September 1935, the rail lines ended for him. He and 80 other exiles were herded onto a steamboat on the Yenisei River. The landscape had changed. The taiga was endless, a green ocean of spruce and pine. They traveled north to the confluence of the Angara River at Strelka, then were transferred to 3 smaller boats pulled by a tug against the current to Kejma. The final leg of the journey was silent and strange. The guards were gone. Bezděk, now effectively a free exile but bound to a specific geography, traveled in a small boat guided by an evenk, an indigenous Siberian, and several women. On October 9, 1935, the boat bumped against the muddy bank of Selengino, a tiny, isolated settlement lost in the wilderness. This was his prison without walls. The residents of Selengino, hardened by the taiga, did not welcome the foreigner. To them he was an interloper, another mouth to feed in a land of scarcity. Bezděk had no shelter, no tools, and no clan. For the entire winter of 1935, he was a ghost haunting the village, walking among the log huts in the biting frost, begging for work or a crust of bread. It was a humiliation as deep as the prison cells. Salvation came with the fishing season at the end of the year. He proved willing to work the nets in the icy river, and slowly the evenks ceased to regard him as a stranger. He learned their rhythms, ate their food, and survived. Then, as abruptly as he had been arrested, his exile ended. The geopolitical winds had shifted slightly, or perhaps his letter from Tyumen had worked its way through diplomatic channels. On August 20, 1936, Bezděk received permission to return to Czechoslovakia. He did not look back. He undertook the month-long journey in reverse, down the Angara, up the Yenisei, and onto the Trans-Siberian Railway. On September 20, 1936, he crossed the border into his homeland. He returned to Svabohov, to the house of his parents, a man of 29 who looked decades older. He tried to stitch his life back together. He could not return to teaching. The trauma was too deep, and perhaps his history made him suspect in the conservative education system. Finding work in the Zabrzeżsko area was difficult for a man with a gap of 10 years in his resume and the stigma of the East upon him. He eventually moved to Prague, the anonymous metropolis, and secured a job as a contracting officer at the state statistics office. In the evenings, he wrote. He poured his memories onto paper, publishing recollections of the Solovetsky camps, the famine, and the Siberian taiga. It was a way to exorcise the ghosts.
But history was not done with Jiří Bezděk. In March 1939, Nazi Germany occupied the Czech lands. At first, the war was background noise to his personal recovery. But the Nazis, obsessed with anti-Bolshevik propaganda, soon took an interest in a man who had first-hand experience of the Soviet paradise. On August 1, 1944, by order of the Nazi authorities, Bezděk was forcibly transferred from the benign obscurity of the statistics office to the Public Information Service. His new role was a grim irony. He was appointed head of the 5th Statistics Section, but his real value to the Nazis was his story. He was sent on tours of Bohemian cities, standing before halls of Czech workers to lecture them on the real conditions in the USSR. He spoke of the hunger, the cold, and the terror. Every word he spoke was true, yet every word was being used to serve a regime just as monstrous as the one he described. He was a puppet dancing on a wire, trapped between two totalitarianisms. He remained in this compromising position until the liberation in May 1945. Peace brought no peace for Bezděk. The liberation of Czechoslovakia was followed by a ferocious purge of collaborators. On May 29, 1945, he was arrested. The new authorities saw only his work for the Nazi propaganda machine, not the coercion behind it. He was thrown into Pankratz prison, investigated for months while the country celebrated its freedom. In October, he was released from custody, though the cloud of suspicion remained until the middle of 1946, when the criminal proceedings were finally halted and he was acquitted. The courts accepted that his cooperation had been a matter of survival, not ideology. By then, he was trying to rebuild again. He found work as a teacher at a vocational school at the Pluto mine in Loka u Litvinova, returning to the profession he had left in Ukraine. By late 1946, he seemed to be ascending, named head of education for trainee miners at the North Bohemian mines in Most. 4 years later, he was head of the recruitment section. But the Communist Party, now fully in control of Czechoslovakia following the 1948 coup, had a long memory and a paranoid nature. Bezděk, a former party member who had been condemned by the Soviets, was a living anomaly. In June 1951, he was fired from his managerial position, officially for failure to perform duties, but the political subtext was screaming. He was reduced to working as a manual laborer. The early 1950s in Czechoslovakia were a mirror image of the 1930s in the USSR. The party began to devour its own, in search of internal enemies. The management of the nationalized mines came under scrutiny. On January 28, 1952, his 58th birthday, Jiří Bezděk was arrested at his workplace. It was a grotesque repetition of his life's trauma. He was escorted to the remand prison in Litoměřice. The investigation dragged on for months. He was lumped into a group labeled Adolf Winkler & Co. The trial took place from November 16 to 18, 1953, at the regional court in Ústí nad Labem. The charge was sabotage, the standard accusation for economic failures in a command economy. The verdict was a foregone conclusion. Bezděk was found guilty and sentenced to 18 years in prison. He was sent first to Litoměřice, then in October 1957 transferred to the dark, fortress-like prison of Mírov, ironically not far from his birthplace in Svábehov. He was a political prisoner once more, this time in his own country, imprisoned by the very ideology he had embraced as a boy of 19. Even behind bars, he fought. He filed requests for review, claiming innocence, but for years his pleas hit the stone wall of the judicial system. Finally, the thaw came. On May 9, 1960, a sweeping amnesty opened the gates of Mírov. Bezděk walked out, a man of 53, his health shattered by 2 different gulags in 2 different empires. He drifted for a while, living briefly with his former family in Litvinov, but he was a man out of time. He eventually moved to Jablonec nad Nisou, a town known for its glass and jewelry. There he found quiet, repetitive work in costume jewelry production at the SVED cooperative. It was small, delicate work, a stark contrast to the felling of trees in the White Sea or the mining of coal in Most. The years of starvation, freezing temperatures, and psychological torture had taken their toll. His body gave out before his time. On September 16, 1968, just weeks after Soviet tanks had once again rolled into Czechoslovakia to crush the Prague Spring, Jiří Bezděk died. He was 61 years old. His life had been a map of the 20th century's greatest tragedies, a journey from hope to horror and back again, caught endlessly in the gears of history.